Sweely is 100 times more creative and innovative than most modern producers of today. But the big question is this: how can you go beyond simply copying Sweely's style and techniques and instead use them as inspiration to develop your own personal musical identity and carve out your own sound? So in this video, we'll be making an underground minimal house tune inspired by Sweely's older gem, NTM. And we're gonna find out if we can do this in under 6 hours by using the 80-20 rule of music production. What you're listening to is the finished song we'll be breaking down today. And I'm going to show you how this Ableton project file was made, layer by layer, in the original order I followed, so you can easily follow along yourself. This tune only took me about 6 hours to finish, completely arranged, mixed, mastered, and ready to be used in DJ sets and sent out to record labels. After having produced music for over 15 years, this is easily the fastest and best way I've come across. You can download this video's project files, as well as over 30 full project files inspired by Beatport Top 100 songs, with new files being added weekly. Just visit the link on screen or in the description. And if finishing songs super fast like this is something you'd like help with, you can also download a free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that I use to completely finish one song per week. But for now, let's start with the first of the 4 quick and easy steps we'll be covering today. First, make sure your song is inspired by the quality of a professional example by choosing a reference track. But stop yourself from straight up copying your reference by having a new hook to focus on. For each one of my projects, I like to make a project file page like this to act as a guide to help clearly explain all the different concepts here. And so for the reference track for this one, we're using Sweely's song NTM. There's 2 main reasons I chose this. One is Sweely is well known as an artist that's very, very good at doing creative sound design and interesting production techniques. So I wanted to learn as many of those as possible. And I found a lot that are actually taught by him, as well as other producers that were inspired by his sound. So there's a lot of cool, interesting tips and techniques that you're going to find in this video. And the second one is, what I like to do is listen to a lot of mixes on YouTube, and what I'll do is Shazam songs a lot. And when I was looking through my Shazams, I actually found this Sweely tune NTM. It's quite a bit of an older tune. I think it came out in 2016 or something like that, quite far back. And this is where he was doing more kind of an underground deep house kind of sound. So I found a cool opportunity here to find a song that's a little bit more underground deep from his older stuff, and then try to incorporate some of the more modern minimal sounds into it. So that was kind of a cool little experiment, and that's kind of what set up the fire here on the reference track. In terms of the new hook, I went for a remix. And this one is Dochi's song on Nissan Altima. And the main reason I picked this is my buddy Dragon has been telling me over and over and over again, yo, flip this one, flip this one, flip this one, flip this one. So I went for it. It has a cool kind of rappy kind of vocal, and I think it works really cool over top of these two. But that is really the thing that I want to quickly give you a little bit of insight into my mindset when picking these, because how do you actually know that these things are going to work? So what I do is I also do a quick little bit of music theory. I'm not a music theory master, but I do a small little test to make sure that I'm going to start these songs knowing that they're going to work well together and it's worth my time to actually produce. So what I'll do is find out a little bit of information, like the key of the Sweely, the reference track, is B flat minor, and the key of the remix track, the new hook, is B minor. So that shows that they're both in minor keys, which is really helpful, and the difference is a simple semitone. So if we open up this music theory cheat sheet, one is in B minor and the other one's in B flat minor. So that means we just have to pitch one up or down a semitone. It's going to be pretty good. If the distance is too large, you might kind of get that chipmunk stupid sound. So knowing that is useful. And then the BPM difference, the reference is in 122 and the new hook, the remix, is in 117 BPM. So that's also quite a close sound. So we know that that'll actually work pretty well. And this gives us some confidence so that we can actually do a good job here. So the key takeaway here, take 10, maybe 15 minutes thinking through the vision for your song by doing a little bit of research. And this way you're going to make sure that you end up with a high quality production. You'll get fired up about the vision for what you're about to embark on. And it also reduces the chances quite a lot that you're going to spend time working on a bunch of different ideas here, hooks and references, and then find out they don't actually work well together at all, and you kind of wasted a bunch of time. But the thing that is way more important than any of this is what we're going to do next, And for that, we're gonna actually have to jump into Ableton and show you how I actually prep and get started on this. So let's do that right now. All right, so this is a look at the Ableton project file for this one. The first thing that I'll do is I'll drag the reference song into the first track here, and I'll turn it off and I'll set it up so that when I press the S key on my keyboard, I can flick back and forth between what we're listening to and then solo the reference. This way we can kind of flick back and forth and make the mixing decisions and the layering decisions as we're building out our track. Then once the reference is in there, what I'll do is I'll listen to it and create an arrangement track like this. And so what this is just empty MIDI clips that show me the larger sections of the song. So what I'm actually going to do is move this over to the left here, because this is actually what my project looks like in the first hour or so of it. As you can see, the arrangement track is a little bit different than what I ended up with, because what I'll do is first do a really faithful recreation of the arrangement so I can know what's interesting about the specific structure of this reference, and then I'll make my own decisions and change it up as I go along here. And also make sure you stick around to the end of the video, because you're going to see how incredibly fast you can actually take a finished loop like this and create a completely structured track in a really fast and intentional way. But for now, the three things that'll really kind of get done at this point is first, confirm the vision of our song by overlapping the reference and the new hook. So you can see here, when you have the sections figured out, you can find a section of the song that doesn't have a section of the reference that does not have any vocals or anything like that taking up the area. It's usually something in the beginning of the track. And then you can layer in the hook. Just grab a section of it, and then what I usually will do is throw an EQ8 and just cut out anything underneath it. So you're kind of removing some of the bass and the low end and trying to kind of single out the vocal. And then you can play it over top of each other to confirm that it actually is working well. And you can play with the pitch of the tune to make sure that it's actually fitting in terms of the key and it's sounding how you want it to. Then the second step is kind of similar to the first, where we're going to find a section of the song that we want to really focus building our loop on. So this could either be a section where there's a little bit less elements so you can focus on hearing the individual layers a bit more, or like a full bodied section of the loop so that you can have more to work with as you're dissecting the tune. In this instance, there's not too much going on in a minimal house tune, so I just picked kind of the first drop. It seemed to have most of the elements that I wanted. And then the next step is to use an AI stem separator to separate out the drums from the reference track, as well as the hook's main layer. So in this instance, it was the vocal from Nissan Altima. Then it looks a little messy here, but the idea is to add those layers into your Ableton project file, and then we can actually start working on building this out. So let's take a listen to the drum so far, and let me know if you can tell the main interesting thing about the kick. So that's a listen to the reference track, the drums from Sweely song NTM, like stem separated out. The main thing here is that what you're actually listening to is the kick has been isolated and separated out. This way I have more control over the kick drum at this point in the production, and I can really focus on the kick and sub relationship. So basically the idea here is with the AI drums, what you can do is take a slice of the kick drum. If the song in the arrangement, you can open this up, and this is the beauty of having an arrangement track like this. If the intro or the outro has like a nice just kind of drum outro, and it's not doing any like high passing, low passing, doing anything interesting, kind of cutting out the low end of the kick, you can slice it from there. But in this instance, I was finding it cleaner to actually find the kick drum inside of the AI separated. So this can be useful, particularly if in the song, like there's too much bass, like a sub or a bass guitar or anything like that overlapping with the drums. You want to find a nice isolated kick sound. So there are a couple ways that you can now isolate the kick drum. You can leave it as is. You can use some EQ to kind of get rid of some kind of the hi-hats or anything else. So you're trying to just focus on the kick. One thing that you can do is you can right click on the kick sample in Ableton 12 and press show similar files. This can be really useful to find something in your library that sounds similar. But the thing that I've been using lately is this cool little trick. It's a beta plugin called Drum Clone. Really big fan of this. So if we throw this in here, this is what the sliced kick sounded like first. And then this is what how Drum Clone processed it. So the cool thing is this uses AI or something. I don't know exactly what it's doing, but it'll re-synthesize the kick drum. So this is actually made with a series of sine waves to recreate the sound. So what you're getting is something that sounds very, very close to the original source material, but it's actually something completely unique. at the same time, and you have a little bit more control over it, and it's, not sliced from the actual track. So huge fan of that. And then what I'll do to kind of keep things really moving quickly, because the main point here really is to start building up the track and confirming that the vision is correct. I think that's really important. So for the AI drums, what I'll simply do is check an EQ 8 on this, and then have like a low cut here, removing everything under about 200 hertz or so, mostly in an attempt to kind of get rid of most of the kick. So essentially we're turning this AI drum part from the Sweely tune into a top loop that we can use. And this way, between the top loop and the kick, we have like a full bodied loop, which sounds pretty sick. And it's going to be a nice fundamental for us to move on. Because what I'm finding is when you start moving into the more melodic elements like the bass and the synths and all that, and how that's interacting with the vocal, that's where things can really go wrong in the production process, and find out like that it's not really working and you need to ditch the song. And if you find that out after spending, 30 minutes or hours on the drums, and then building it out that far and then realizing that the song isn't worth continuing, that's a problem and you're kind of wasting time. So what I like to do is have a nice shortcut to have a nice loop going, and then we can build out the track from here. So in terms of any other processing, the main thing that I'll do here is we have the sound. In terms of the pattern, it's just a 4 on the floor. So I have the template set up to kind of automatically have this 4 on the 4 pattern. And then what I'll do then is have these extra little accent notes here. And so this is just like a little trick that he's doing to kind of make the drum track a little bit more interesting. It's a pretty simple thing that you can do to any one of your tunes, add this little extra little hit. So if you pay attention to the kick, it's like 1, 2, 3, do. So it just makes it a little bit more interesting, but usually like most kick patterns just kind of 4 on the floor, standard stuff like that. In terms of any processing, the main thing here is flicking back and forth between what you have and the reference, and just trying to dial in the volume. So the idea is get the pattern right, get the sound selection right, and then get the volume. And that's going to really be the key to like 80-20 reference kind of mixing here. But in terms of any other processing that's going on here, throwing on a drum bus here, adding in some of the booms. So it's kind of adding a little bit more of like that subby frequency, making the kicks sound a little bit thicker, fuller kind of thing. And then just a little kick clip at the end, which is more of a mixing technique that I'll talk about more near the end of the video. So that's kind of a really good look at that. At this point, what I would then do is then quickly move on to the sub. So I want to kind of start building up the melodic sound of this tune as quickly as possible. And so for that, let's take a look and listen to everything together with the sub, and I'll start breaking it down. Cool. So it's a pretty cool, like kind of minimal, and not in the sense of like minimal house, but like that like very like few notes being hit, kind of like old school house kind of vibe, which I really dug this. And the way that I got this, the notes to start, is the AI separator tool that I'm using, by the way, is one called Nuo Stems. I like it because it's just cheap and there's no monthly fee. But also, whenever you separate anything, it's going to separate out the drums and the bass and the vocals and like any other synth stuff. So then from here, we have this like AI separated bass. And what you can do in Ableton is you can grab that audio clip into an empty MIDI clip, and it'll have this convert audio to MIDI function. And it's not the best, but it does kind of get you there a little bit closer. So then from there, you kind of have a nice jumping off point, and we'll take a look at the MIDI if you want to have like a closer look at it yourself here. It gives you a jumping off point, so you can flick back and forth between what you're working on and the reference, flicking back and forth between what you're working on and the AI bass. And then that way, what you can kind of just use your ear and move the notes around. Also, another important little tip here is, because we've done some of that music theory research, we can set Ableton's 12's key to be in the same key, and it'll highlight the notes that are in the right scale as the reference track as well. So this way, it just kind of makes things a little bit easier, takes some of the guesswork out of the way. And this is one of those things, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And so this is kind of what the pattern ended up like in terms of the sound design. I'm just using, the way I always like to start with the sub first. So I have this little device I've created called the V sub, and it's basically just an Ableton operator, just doing a sine wave, because it's one of the most basic wave shapes and can really carry a lot of low end. And then the idea is then dial in varying amounts of saturation, and the saturation is just going to make that sub sound a little bit grittier and come out of like laptop speakers a bit more. And it's also going to fill out those low mids, and so it's going to blend in more with our mid bass layers in a way to add a full picture of the bass, which we'll get into in just a second. We also have some one knob sidechain. I have it set up with a Ableton, like a Max for Live device, so we can just do it with one knob instead of having to route compressors. And then a little bit of drum bus to add a little bit of kind of saturation, and another bit of saturation to the bass sound here. Usually I don't add this in, but in this instance I did. Kind of a good look at that. Then the main thing is to flick back and forth again between what you're working on here and the reference, really listening to the low end. You'll kind of hear some mid sounds as well in the bass, but you kind of want to just really try to focus on the sub sound at this instance. So I can give you a listen to what that actually would sound like at this point in the production. This is just the sub. So you can hear, like, especially on like headphones or good speakers, like that's carrying the majority of the bass sound. Super important stuff. And then what I have set up here is I've called it a bass grouping system, and I'll point to videos that'll explain all of these concepts a little bit more in detail if you want to dive into anything more. But basically the idea is you can set the instead of all ins, you can set it to route it to a different channel. So I've routed the in from the sub, so the MIDI of this is automatically going to this layer. Then you have a pitch device in case the sub layer, whatever that octave is playing, doesn't match or sound good on your mid bass layer. You can adjust it just from here. I'm using like a standard like bass guitar sound that I really like to use, kind of trying to go for the idea of reusing sounds, subtle sounds throughout each production, so you're kind of building a sonic identity. Playing around with adding a little bit of erosion on the bass. I think this is a trick that I heard that I think Rosie uses, another minimal house artist. So trying to incorporate little tricks that people in these genres are using. Big thing with the mid bass layer is to roll off everything around 200 hertz or so. This way you're preventing any mud, and you're making it so that sub is really taking care of the low end, and this is mostly taking care of the low mids and kind of mids. Little echo here that I think I saw somebody else who was doing a going over like Gyokos or Coulter at the time, or now Coulter's minimal house tracks, and he had this little echo that he put on some of the basses. So a little trick here. I think it's kind of essentially like a slapback echo. So it just adds a bit of like width and some kind of interest to that layer, I would say. And then this is a little standard channel strip that I have on all my tracks. So mixing as you go is kind of the idea. A little bit of EQ cutting at the low end, and then a couple of quick moves here. So in this instance, I'll go over this as it's needed, and I'll point to also a video where I explain this and how to build something like this. But in this instance, the main thing is a one knob sidechain. So we're just adding that pumping effect, making room for the kick, and doing it in a way where it's with one knob, so we can kind of get a decent sidechain effect and move on quickly with the production. And then the next thing that I added in was these accent notes, and this is something that I've been hearing a lot more in music. It seems like there's kind of like two basses, like there's the main solid bass and then an additional bass layer kind of adding in these additional accents. So I'll play it without the accents notes first. And then I'm going to add in the accent notes now. And then I'm going to solo the accent notes. So cool little like plucky kind of sound. I think I saw this in some other minimal like tutorials on Sweely sound. It was like this idea of like a very plucky sound with like some resonance. And this like works really cool in that kind of like old school underground house sound as well. In terms of the pattern, I just kind of like, I think I just did it by ear, kind of like flicking back and forth to the reference. The subby sound was missing these little accent notes, and I just heard it and picked up on it. And I'll just show you the MIDI so you can have a look. It's just accenting some different notes. I think it's kind of doing a little bit of a call and response. If we look kind of here and compare the sub notes, and actually no, what it's doing is like on these first ones, it's reinforcing a couple hits, and then it's doing a call and response here. So it goes sub, and then there's a little bit of an extra accent note that responds. So that's kind of a look at that. And then in terms of the sound design, what I actually did was I sliced out a piece of the AI bass that was separated. So it's just like the bass tone that's been separated from the AI, using AI. And then I right-clicked and did show similar files in Ableton 12. And it'll also show you like, not just samples. So it actually found this like Ableton basic trigger bass kind of little preset or whatever, and this sounded really cool, and I found this with the similar sound functionality, and this is what I used to quickly get a similar sound instead of having to do sound design from scratch or anything like that, which is cool. I just don't like to do that. It slows me down, and I don't find it fun, and I don't like to produce in any way that's not fun, basically. And so in terms of any processing, we're just removing a bunch of the low. Same idea as we want the sub to take good care of it, even if it's not playing like the same notes, we still want the sub to really be taking care of a lot of that low end. And then just a little bit of high shelving to kind of remove some of the high end in a less harsh way. And then we have some of this standard channel trip mix as you go stuff. So we're dialing in some sidechain, a little bit of width. So this is the free Polyverse wider plugin. I've just mapped the main knob to this. And so this is pushing it to the left and right a bit, making it a bit more stereo, trying to make the bass more full, but without impacting the sub and the low end in any weird way. And dialing in some sustain. This is the free kilohertz transient shaper. Again, just map some of the core knobs, so the attack and the sustain. So we're dialing back the sustain to tighten up the sound. I feel like tighter sounds are a lot more professional. A little bit of Ableton saturation here to kind of push it out a little bit more and add a little bit of grit. And the main thing is flicking back and forth, so the reference, trying to get the volume correct. So at this point, this is kind of where I would be. And then what I would do is then add in the vocal. And so at this point, what we have is like the AI drums. We have our kicks isolated, so the kick is playing nicely with the sub and the bass and all that. But also at this point, like the sub notes, the bass notes might be a little too carbon copy. So what I'll then do is like add the vocal in, find a section of the vocal that I want to work with, and then play that in context with the drums and the bass that we've built, and start adjusting the notes and maybe a bit of the sound, but mostly the notes of the bass, so that it is in service of the hook more and playing against the hook a lot more in a way that it's highlighting the uniqueness of the vocal. And then it's also kind of pushing us in a more unique territory away from a carbon copy. So at this point, with the vocal and the bass and the drums, it sounds a little bit like this. So what you just listened to is what I will finish within the first hour, and that hour includes some of that research that we were talking about even before we jumped into Ableton. And really the big lesson here is to test out your song's vision with as little time and effort as possible at the beginning in this first step, to make sure you aren't wasting your time later on developing an idea that might never work. So next time you start a new song, always find a reference and hook combination, prep your project file, and get the start of your 8 or 16 bar loop working nicely as quickly as possible. But none of this will matter unless you actually finish the loop that you started, and we're going to do it in a very special way that's going to put us in a position where structuring and arranging our song to actually finish it is going to become the easiest and fastest part of the entire process. All right, so what I'll do next is focus on building out the melodic elements. And again, this is the same, following through with the same idea where we want to work on the melodic elements first, or that's what I choose to do, because this is where the track can fall apart. We can very quickly create the drums tracks, and we'll get over that in a second. I find it's actually so fast to do with this particular method. And so because of that, I like to really focus on the melodic elements first. And what I'm going to show you is how I built things out and the methods and some of the tricks I used. One thing I want to mention is I'm going to play it without the vocal, because it gets annoying with two voices over top of each other, and like there could be some copyright issues or whatever. But I do want to mention that while I'm building out these melodic elements in almost every part of the song, I'll have the vocal on almost like 90% of the time, because you want to add new elements, always adding them in so they're in service of that main hook, reinforcing it. Not trying to steal the spotlight or anything like that. At least that's like kind of the philosophy that I have when producing. So with that said, let's have a listen to the melodic elements added into our AI drums and kick and sub. Okay, so for this kind of minimal house style, I really like that idea of like cutting up different chord stabs and kind of moving them around like the stereo panorama and having kind of weird echoey dub sounds on them. So that's kind of the first element that I tackled. So I'm going to just solo out kind of the first few layers. And I want you to kind of, we'll work through it and then listen to kind of the call and response and how this kind of builds all out together. So it kind of starts off with this little stab at the beginning. And then it has another swell into it. And then just slowly additional layers are being added this almost could be imagined like in traditional like producing. This might be done by like one instrument, but instead it's done by a bunch of different chord stabs and piano stabs. And I'll just look up in Splice, piano stab, Rhodes stab, different things like that, and switch the key so that it's actually in the same key as our song. And the idea here is it's kind of really going for that, like if we listen to the reference track, it has mostly just one kind of like cool chord little progression that's going on. So it's kind of trying to go for that underground vibe of that, while also adding in a bit more of the more modern sound of minimal going on here. So in terms of any of the processing here, what I want to really highlight here is the thought process for each layer. So basically just trying to come up with an interesting little kind of chord stab progression. And then in terms of the processing, I'll always do this standard channel strip mix as you go processing. So the idea is to start from the left to the right. We're going to usually remove everything under 200 hertz. So we're making sure that things aren't muddy and making room for the sub to really shine through. So I have it set up on this template to always cut off 200 hertz. That way you can adjust it left and right if you want to. The main elements that don't have that happening is the sub and the kick. Those I just leave completely the low end intact. Then I'll consider anything in terms of tightening up the sound with the transient designer, usually pulling back the sustain. In this instance, it's fine. And then adding some sidechain, again, making room for the kick, and adding a little bit of that cool dancey pumping effect. Considering width, considering saturation, but the main thing is like flicking back and forth between the reference track and what's going on in the reference track to kind of get a similar vibe. And what's interesting is it's not as close to the reference. So it's a little different. So trying to listen to like what we have, and it's just trying to somewhat get the volume correct. That's the main thing. And this is, I think, a really fun portion of the songwriting process, because this is where you can really start to let your own creativity come in. I like cutting up samples and doing this kind of thing. You might have a different take on how you like to go about this. And so you can just start building things out in a lot more interesting way. For me, I feel like the cool thing with the minimal house sound is different sounds moving around the stereo spectrum instead of one sound playing something. So that's the idea of having all these different little chord stabs. Some are pan-centered, some are part like 28 to the right, 15 to the left, 23 to the right, 22 to the left. And the idea is to also have the panning so that like there's a call and response. So one will call on the left, and then the other element will respond on the right. So it's this idea of movement going on. I'm going to just quickly go through any of the layers here, see if there's anything interesting. This here is super interesting. This is a free plugin called A1 Trigger Gate. And it's really good for that stutter house effect, but there's also some of these presets in here that add this cool like Dubby echo. So I'm going to show you what this one layer sounds like without it. So I have some delay on there, but then with this trigger gate thing, which is free by the way, it does a really good job of like a moving Dubby echo and adds a little bit of that stuttery sound to the initial hit. I think that's super interesting. I really, really like that. I don't think this is something that anybody's really using, but you're trying to create that Dubby sound, Dubby echoey sound with some of this minimal house stuff. And so that's a cool trick there to add something like that. You can use a different effect, but you're trying to add in Dubby echoey things. It's like all about moving around the stereo panorama. It's echoing out with very small hits. It's not like huge sustained notes. They're all like kind of stabs and being echoed out to add space to it. We got standard channel strip on this one, standard channel strip on this one. Another one with that A1 trigger gate, so I can kind of show you what that one sounds like. This was the initial stab without it. It's kind of like a Rhodesy kind of really low end, not low end, but make mid-ish sound. Not too much high in it is what I'm trying to say. And then with the trance gate kind of echoey thing, it adds so much more vibe and character, and also adds like more of a stereo effect. And yeah, I think that's a really, really cool thing to add in here. What else do we got? Standard channel strip again. We're doing some like there's something going on with the EQ here. You can see this one, we're removing a ton of the high end. This one, not too much. So sometimes you're just like trying to adjust the EQ a little bit. Cool. So I think that's a cool look at that initial little bit of like that's where I kind of started. Then I started adding in some additional little minimal tricks. So this element here, I want to kind of play by itself for a second. So it's almost percussive, and this is something that you'll probably see in a lot of minimal house tutorials. So this is people have been calling it the Sweely technique, and essentially what the idea is you stick a vocoder on like a drum part, and then you switch the carrier to external, and then you bring in the audio from either like a chord that you're playing at, like a pad, or you can also use audio samples. So in the examples that I've been finding, a lot of people have been like writing out like a kind of a sustained chord progression and then routing it to that. What I like to do is instead route it to another track that is playing audio. So in this instance, I'm routing it to that like accent bass sound. I like the idea of like reusing stuff a lot more when you can. It adds like a cohesiveness to the tune, and it's also a little bit of a faster way to produce. So instead of having to like write out some chords, I was able to just grab a melodic element that I've already built out. So that's a cool idea there. I threw in this little pitch hack, so it's going up a full octave. And then what is this? The LFO. This is another pretty cool minimal housey technique that I would recommend a lot, is using LFOs to add movement to your sounds. So the idea is this LFO is at a rate of 0.09 hertz, so it's going quite slowly, and I've mapped it to the formant of the vocoder. So it's slowly moving that sound over time, and it's adding some interest and some movement, and really, really cool technique. Like chucking an LFO on almost anything can be like a really cool way to add interest to anything. Definitely a big tip in the minimal house area. And then this one here, I think I found this from, there's a minimal producer that I followed a while back, Kimba's Academy. Cool guy, has a lot of really, really, really cool tutorials and stuff like that. And he showed me this thing called Tantra, and Tantra is just like, let me show you what it sounds like without Tantra. You can hear it, it's very percussive, and then with Tantra, I'll also turn up the volume a bunch. It's adding like kind of like filtering and more like echoey kind of stuff. So again, I think that like filtery, echoey, dubby kind of sound is like pretty important here. And it's just the presets on this are amazing. You can just like rip through the preset, and you can just dial in the mix to kind of like easily get a minimal sound on anything. Glitchy drums, more glitchy kind of moving melodic parts, all that really works quite well. Then just removing a bunch of the low end, same mix as you go stuff. I threw a little phaser flanger on there, so it's kind of making it a little wet and moving, just trying to make it sound a little bit more interesting. And then standard channel strip, so a little bit of sidechain width pushed to the left and right. Nothing else really there. So that's a cool technique as well that you might want to look into. That's not super interesting. Let's have a look at this one. So this is also doing the same vocoder technique. And it's using the same drum bit. So you can see it's MT drip 125 origami 2, and this one is the exact same. So again, the idea is to reuse stuff, so it also saves time and also adds cohesion where possible. And this one is just using a different audio source. In this instance, what I'm doing is a little bit more what I've noticed other people doing with this technique, which is having an audio source and then disabling it. So this is the audio source. It's turned off in the track. Clav thing. I think in some other tutorials I saw like that clav sound is kind of popular in minimal house, so I was trying to incorporate that in some way. And so this is using that same drum percussion as the notes, and it's bringing in the sound of that clav. And so what it sounds like is this. Kind of makes it more stuttery and echoey and dubbier. Same idea, using an LFO to move the formant, so it's changing the sound over time. I've also added in that A1 trigger gate thing, so it's adding a bit more of that dubby echo to things. Removing some lows, carving out some highs. I threw in a compressor to kind of reduce the dynamic range and make it a more of a consistent level, and then just some sidechain. Nothing crazy there. What I wanted to add in is this bass playing? I didn't use that. It sounds like poo. I think I used this. Actually, no, I didn't use that, so that's not used. The idea here is, at this point here, you can see there's a couple of like tracks that I didn't actually use in the final production. And because the idea here is to like overproduce the loop that you're working on here, so that you have more elements than you even need when you start arranging. And that's really one of the big tricks here. When you have several layers to work with, it's going to make it a lot easier when you're like stretching out the song over your timeline, because you can have more things to filter in and take away, and you kind of prevent that I think it's a problem, or I think it really just slows down the production process when, as you're building out the tune, you're like, oh, I need to make a completely new layer here. I need to make a completely new layer here. And then you're kind of jumping between the arrangement and like production process. If you can like get as much done as possible in your loop, and that way when you move on to structuring and arrangement, it's going to be, it's just a lot easier because you can really just focus on that main idea. So that is a look at like the melodic parts. At this point, you can see here, like especially with the vocal added in, it sounds fucking sick. So yeah, it sounds pretty sweet, I would say. And this is like a good point where I'd be like in the production process where okay, it built out. I have an idea of what the drums are going to be like. I'm going to need to redo them, but like the bass is working with the kick. All the melodic stuff is working with the vocals. This is cool. Like I'm feeling good about this. This is maybe 2 hours into the production process. And now I know that like this is a tune that's worth definitely pursuing. So at this point, I'll like turn off the AI drums and start building out the drums. And so I find this like to be incredibly fast and easy to do. So I'll kind of just hit you up with how my method of doing this. The main thing again is we're following that 80-20 rule of reference and reference production, which is flicking back and forth to the reference and building out layers one by one. The trick is to focus on the layer that is coming out at you the most, or that you feel is the most important, starting with what you hear is the most important, and then like slowly filling in the gaps as you go along. So in this instance, for whatever reason, what I heard first was this extra little tom. I think I wanted it to like play against the kick drum a little bit more. So let's have a look and listen to this. Let me turn off everything. We're gonna just listen to the drums. Well, let me turn that on. And soloed. So this is almost like an accent, similar to how we had an accent on the bass. This is like an accent for the kick. It's just adding a little bit more interest. It's almost like a ghost note. And so I just found this like low tom sound, had it so it's playing against the kick, like almost responding to it. And we're just carving out a bunch of the lows because we want the most of the sub, like the low end of the kick to be taking care of this. This is just somewhat reinforcing and adding a little bit of interest to the kick pattern, and then removing a whole ton of the highs because we're just trying to like nestle it in quite a bit. No sidechain, no width. That's really it with that one. The next one that really is a bit more important, this really shows like that 80-20 reference mixing style and layering style, is usually, I would say it's like the open hat. The open hat is what you're going to hear first. I find open hat, or maybe like snare clap. For me, it's usually the open hat. And so let's take a look and listen to this. And so when building out a layer, usually the order I like to go in is first figure out the pattern, then the sound selection, and then dial in the volume and a little bit of processing. So for this one, open hat, standard, like what I started with here is like the standard open hat pattern. And again, I've set up my template so that it's just going to have that already in here. So I'm just like moving the sound selection to figure out the right sound as opposed to like punching in the notes every time. And so it's just that offbeat kind of sound. And the main thing is there's this little like fill at the end. And I've been noticing a little bit of this too. I want to try to get into this more in these videos, but there's usually like micro hooks all throughout the production. So there's usually something like a small, interesting repeating hook in the drums, a small, interesting repeating hook in the bass. And they're unique in themselves, and they also reinforce the main hook. In this instance, I would say that cool little bit is that like little fill at the end. If you listen, normal, and then fill. And that is going to play with some of the other elements in a really interesting way, and it makes the drum loop a lot more interesting and less mechanical and interesting, and just more interesting. So that's a look at the pattern. Basically, I've doubled up the sound, so it looks a little bit more complicated than it is. In terms of the sound, what I've done is I've actually sliced out a piece of that open hat, and I've layered that in here. And what I've done is I've just pulled back the attack, so the initial hit of that stolen, sliced out hi-hat sound isn't coming in as much, because I want that transient, that main initial hit to come from a higher quality one shot in my actual library. So what we have here is the like sliced out hi-hat from Sweely tune. It's from the AI sliced out, so it's nice and isolated already. Played around with this pitch envelope in the drum sampler, so it's starting actually lower and then moving up to the actual pitch of what it's set here. And then what I did is I right-clicked and did show similar files and found some other hi-hats in my library that have a similar sound. And then I've layered that one in here. And this one's kind of taking care of more of that initial transient and also trying to carry a bit more of the weight. So like the initial hit and the bit more of the quality of it is coming from this one shot from my library. And then more of the tail and some of like kind of like the vibe and character of the sound is coming in from the sliced thing from the AI, the sliced hi-hat from the AI, not the thing. That then takes care of the sound selection, and then what I'm doing is I'm bringing in a bit more of the attack on with like the transient shaper, dialing back the sustain on all of the hits here, so it's a tighter sound. I think tighter sounds, particularly in minimal house, is incredibly important. So having stuff like control over the ADSR if you're making it with synths or anything like that, or using transient designers, or if you're using samplers and you have access to like the attack, hold, and decay and all that, making tighter sounds always is really important for this. And I think it's also really important for just a professional sound in general, to be honest. That's more of an opinion, but I think tighter sounds sound more professional. And then we're just removing a bunch of the low end automatically, making room for the kick. Main thing, flicking back and forth between the reference and what we've built to try to get that open hat volume to sound similar volume and power as what's in the reference. The next thing is usually I like to reinforce the open hat with a closed hat. So that's the next layer we're going to look at here. The closed hat, the pattern is following the same, little offbeat kind of pattern as the open hat. So this is good because it's reinforcing that open hat sound, making it sound a little bit more interesting. And then also like a little bit, I don't know, maybe thicker, you might say. And it's also a good arrangement trick. So if you ever pull out the open hat, you still have like a closed hat driving the tune. And then what we have is like a little fill at the end, kind of playing. If you see here, actually, like take a look at where the mouse is. The closed hat like has like a little call, and then the open hat has the response. So now all together, it sounds something like this. Is kind of like how I would sing the micro hit hook that I'm hearing. And it's really cool. Like this is really adding a lot of interest to this drum loop instead of making it sound super basic. In terms of the sound design, I have these hi-hat closed ones. When I did the show similar file kind of process with the closed hat, it showed me a bunch of open hats and closed hats. So the closed hats I just dragged into this section here. So again, showing similar files from the AI sliced hat from the reference track makes it super easier to work on this kind of stuff. In terms of any sound design, a little bit of dialing back the sustain so it's a tighter sound, removing some low end. Main thing is bringing up the volume so that this one's a little bit interesting because this is like a layer that's reinforcing the main open hat. So for this, you're kind of dialing in the volume a bit to taste, and then also listening to those extra little fill notes and how that is compared against the reference track. But in this one, it's a little bit more of your own vibe that you're going for. You're trying to dial in the closed hat, so it's reinforcing the open hat in a way where they almost sound congruent. They sound cohesive. They sound like they're meant to be together. It's kind of the idea. The next element that I added in was the snare. So this is what I was hearing. The next most important thing. Let's take a look and listen to that. And so it looks a little bit confusing at first. Usually same thing with like kind of using a template to get things going. I have it set up so that it probably would start like this. So it's on the 2 and the 4 of the beat here. Classic clap and snare pattern. Why punch it in every single time? Because this way I can throw this in here and then I can press option and then like it'll duplicate if I want a layer, and then I can add in extra little fill ghost notes and stuff like that. So in terms of the pattern, it's just classic 2 4 2 4 with a little bit of like a drum fill. That's kind of what I was hearing. There was something similar to that in the reference, and then I kind of just expanded on it a bit, like as I was kind of hearing it against my new hook. So it's just like bam, bam, bam with a little bit of a little fill here. In terms of the sound selection, what I did was I sliced out a kick This is a little bit of a trick here, so I'm going to show you this real quick. But the idea is, I think it's this drum right here, if we listen to this. So that is the AI snare, and the way that I did it is I found a slice of the snare in the AI drums and then dragged it to its own track, and then used an EQ to remove the kick drum, and then right-clicked and did a freeze and flatten. This way you have a sample with the kick removed. If you were to do that on like this track here, where we still have the EQ active, it's gonna have the kick playing in that slice. So when you do the show similar files, it's going to give you a lot of kick drums. So sometimes if you want to isolate something that is layered, you might need to use some EQ or something like that to try to isolate that. So in this instance, we're trying to remove a lot of the kick drum from the snare. Then we could use the show similar files functionality to more accurately find examples inside of our library. So that's how I ended up finding a bunch of different snare options for the snare. And then also something that I have in all of my templates and projects is like 4 or 5, 6 snare sounds that I've already like pre-vetted that I like. So they're always there in case I want to use a familiar sound that I use in a lot of my productions that I know sound good. It's going to speed up the process, and it also adds a bit of to that sonic identity in a small way where there's reoccurring sounds throughout my tracks. And then in terms of any processing, nothing too interesting here. We're just removing some low end. Main thing is flicking back and forth between the reference, getting the volume correct. Then similar idea is either if you do the snare first or the clap first, I usually like to reinforce snares with claps, or reinforce the clap if I did the clap first with a snare. The idea is the idea I'm going for is snares straight down the middle and clap left and right, doing some stereo stuff. And actually there's one thing I want to show you that's interesting in this snare. It's a little weird trick that I don't think I've seen anybody else do, but it's similar to the minimal house idea of cutting up weird little loops and having sounds moving around in interesting glitchy ways. So if we listen to the snare, one of these snares got something weird on it, if you could hear. Yeah, I found this weird laser modular kind of sounding snare. If we play it. So when I was doing the show similar sounds thing, like you can really get sometimes it's really off and it'll show you some like ass sounding stuff. But in this instance, I was like, that doesn't sound like a snare, but it's kind of weird and I like it. So I threw it in the snare rack to add as a layer, just playing a little bit sometimes. And with this effects here called stretch, which is on the new Ableton 12 drum sampler, it like stretches out the sample in like kind of a granular kind of way. And then I threw an auto pan on it, so it's kind of moving around the left and right. And then also that A1 trigger with kind of that Dubby echo. So that way that sound is being stretched and panned and dub echoed. And again, that's like a pretty cool minimal vibe that we're going for, similar to how we were applying that to the melodic stuff. We're going to be applying similar stuff to the drums to make things sound interesting in a subtle, unique, cool way. I really, really do love that about minimal. There's so many cool sound design tricks and interesting, subtle things that you can apply any of these to any genre of song, and it'll kind of make it sound a bit more modern and like interesting, just having moving sounds and glitchy, dubby sounds. Like, it's such a cool, all of these things are so cool that you can apply to so many of your own genre. So I feel like it's a really interesting genre to study. So then let's move on. Next thing is layering in the clap. And solo it. And then play it with the snare. So you can hear the clap is just adding some kind of high end to it. In terms of the sound design, I found some claps when I did the show similar sound functionality on the snare to find some additional claps here. I layered them in. Usually what I like to do is I have one pandle bit to the left and one panned to the right, usually. Not in this instance. And it's probably this one that's panned to the right. Yeah. So one that's panned a bit to the left, one that's panned a bit to the right is the idea. And that's kind of really it on this one. The idea is like I mentioned, snares down the middle and claps a little bit on the left and right. That's kind of a preference thing for me and a little bit maybe an identity thing for me. I don't know if it's like a hard or fast rule. So then the next thing here is the idea is to first get like the core loops with one shot. So we have our kick with one shots, we have our open hat with one shots, we have our closed hat, snares, claps with one shots. This is the core loop. And this is like, for most parts, like the body of the track. But then to make things actually sound more professional and interesting and start moving it into more unique territory, what I like to then do is layer on drum breaks and top loops. And the idea is to layer them in subtly, so they're reinforcing the core loops, not like we're just chucking a bunch of loops on here and then that's our drum sound. It's done in a very intentional way. So let's start listening through some of the loops that I added. First one was this one here. I'm going to solo it. So this one, you can hear the main thing that this is adding is more snare in terms of the main snare hit, as well as extra kind of like filly parts in between, and it's like, it's so vibey. Really like this loop here. Something that I'll do often is set it to beats and then transients and have it so this little arrow's pointing to the right, and if you dial this then back from 100, it's going to kind of reduce the sustain, and it's kind of doing similar to the transient shaper. It's going to tighten up the sound a lot. So what I like to do a lot in this is with the tops is kind of tighten them up so they're not ringing out as much, and kind of that's really the main thing. They're not ringing out as much, so they're tighter, and so they kind of blend in a little bit more with our core loops is kind of the idea. In terms of EQ, we're removing a bunch of the low end, shelving out a bit of like the low mids, and then removing some of the high end here. Some sidechain so it's pumping, some width so it's pushing it to the left and right. And then the main thing is kind of volume, like listening to the reference and listening to the volume. But again, this is kind of like you're trying to dial it into the clap. So a good technique could be to start the track at 0 and then keep bringing in the volume until you hear it having an effect, and then maybe pull back from there. And it's something that you're going to have to develop your ear over time, but that's kind of an idea of the philosophy and the mindset and how I go about this. Oh man, I got to tell you another freaking really cool tip here. Another way how I actually found all of these top loops is what you can actually do, and I love this. And this is the first time I'm talking about it in a video, so I'm going to be a bit more excited. But when you AI stem separate out the drums, like the loop like we did at the beginning, man, I can't believe I didn't think of this sooner. Right click, show similar files, and now you can find like top loops and drum breaks and all sorts of like drums that are based on the reference loop that you have here. So you can see the NY drums breaks was here. A lot of the ones that I use in this is with the show similar sound functionality on the main AI drum part. So love that. And you get to hear me be super excited about it for the first time. So that's cool. Moving on, the next top loop I added was this one. And then soloed. And so if you can hear this one is reinforcing more of the hi-hats here. And so in terms of, we're doing that same transient pull technique, and then removing a lot of the low end, shelving out a bit of the highs, trying to nestle it in. Like we want the majority of like the high end and all that stuff to be carried on with our main core loops. So the idea is to kind of nestle things in here. A little sidechain so it's pumping, and a bit of width so we're pushing it to the left and right. Next one I added was this. Solo it. So there's a little bit of like the shuffly snares going on there, but the real thing is that I really like that like woo, woo. And then what I did to kind of like, if you see here the starting point, I just moved over because I wanted it to do like boo, boo, which is not really a minimal house thing. I think that's more of a jack-in house thing. But I wanted to like, you know, have fun with it and start moving things into a more unique direction by making some changes like that. Removing some low end, removing some high end, sidechain so it's pumping, dialing back the attack so it's not hitting as hard, where we want our main core hits to hit hard there. Next element I added was this. Soloed. So a little bit of hi-hat, a lot of snare, and then that extra little like Congo thing is what this is really adding in. We did the transient pull technique, removing some lows, shelving out. I think it was like I was trying to remove some of the hi-hat here. I didn't want too much hi-hat coming in from this loop. Little sidechain, a little bit of width. I've got a little ride playing, but that's not super interesting. If you want to look at any of this stuff in more detail, you can definitely grab the project files. And so then the next thing really is, what you want to do here is basically overproduce your loop, right? And use the reference track and your structure track as like as a guide. And then what we're gonna be able to do is use that as a guide to actually finish our tune super fast. So now we're gonna get into the structuring process, and this is gonna be one of the quicker parts actually. So what I'll do as a first step is, what I would like you to do is like imagine that these are all puzzle pieces. So what we've done is we've built out this big loop. We have the vocals, the kick, we have the bass, we have the drums, we have the melodic information. And now what we can do is, what I'll actually do is, first I'll do a blind, I've been calling it a blind structuring. So looking at the intro, break, drop, what I'll do is just grab, like the intro is just drums, I'll grab the drums, paste that in, grab the kick, throw that in there too. Then we got a break. So usually the break in most songs is like drums without the bass. So let's remove the bass here. Or the bass will come in, but what we might do is like remove the low end of it. So I have on my master channel like a bunch of little effects here, but the one I want to focus on right now is just a filter. So then you could just come in here on the break, remove some of the low end there. It's actually over here. Boom. Follow just like what we got going on here. Boom, and then we have the main loop here, and then you can just kind of copy and paste everything over using the structure arrangement track as a guide to kind of get everything like a 30,000 foot view really quickly of a finished track. You're kind of like you're close to being there. Then the idea after that I'll do is actually I'll go through each section by section and actually listen to the reference and then kind of try to emulate what's going on in that one section, going section by section. So flicking for the reference and what I have and adjusting the layers and any kind of tricks that's happening in the references arrangement or structure to match and kind of go through the intro, then the break and the sub, etc. Then once that's done, or maybe somewhere in between it, it's kind of a fluid process, but I'll start like changing the structure. So if you can see here, this was the original structure. I'm not usually a fan of Sweely's structuring techniques as much as I like everything else that he does, to be honest. So I went and totally switched it up. And this is also pretty important anyways, because you might want to use the original like reference as a structuring like starting point, but you don't necessarily want to fully copy it because it's going to be structured in a way to make their hook sound really good, and you have a new hook, so you're going to want to make some changes here, right? And so this is a good opportunity to make your own decisions of how you'd like the track to go. Really quick, I'll just kind of go through each section. So we went with the intro for longer than normal, like what is that, 16 bars? Actually, I think it's pretty normal. Drums, a little bit of like melodic stuff. After 8 bars, a big tip here is every 8 bars, every 16 bars, there's usually some small changes. Maybe every 16 bars, every 32 bars, there's larger changes. So you can see after the first 8 bars, kick coming in, and a little bit of some bass. Then I liked this part of the Sweely tune where it just went right into like a mini break. So the idea here is really having a lot more of the melodic stuff coming in and then filtering in the vocals, a tease. And this is a cool little, like, I think like Rossi and a lot of like middle house people do this too. This little kind of kick fill essentially that comes in instead of using like drums. You're actually doing that with like a kick drum to add a little bit of interest. And then we got the main sub come in. And then we're starting to filter in the vocals. Vocals are fully in. And then build it down. So the idea is just remove a lot of the drums and it's just mostly just kick. And then we got a bigger break. Vocals and melodic stuff and just that accent bass. And then we're going to go into the drop. And it kind of just carries on and on and on. If you want to have a closer look at all the details here, because there's quite a bit of like automation and small tricks like that throughout the tune that you might want to check out if you actually have the project file. It's better just to jump into that. I could spend here all day. And I think actually with that, I'm going to probably cut it short here. I feel like I've been going on and on and on. And so hopefully you found this useful. Let's jump into the 80-20 rule recap so you can actually apply some of this to your own stuff.
Hi, my friend, Matt from Best Friends Club here. And if you've been paying attention to this super long video, then you've probably figured out what the 80-20 rule is when it comes to building out your songs. The goal here is to get 80% of the result with only 20% of the time, energy, and effort. And because the first key to the 80-20 rule here is to use a reference track, we're making sure that we're very easily hitting 80% of a high quality, professionally made song. In particular, we use that reference track to make sure that we're picking the right notes, sounds, and volumes as we're building out our song. The second key of the 80-20 rule here is to mix as you go in an extremely streamlined way by only focusing on the volume of each track, as well as using a simple repeatable channel strip for each track that we're adding to our songs. The third and final key is to repurpose your old project files and have a suite of powerful templates, Ableton racks, and one-knob effects that you've personalized and curated over time. If you'd like to get a head start by downloading all the racks, templates, and all the files that you've seen me use in the Ableton project file for this video, or if you'd just like to take a closer look at any of the techniques or tracks you saw me work on in this video at your own pace, you can find a link to this video's project files on screen now and at the second link that's in the YouTube description. I'm recreating a different song from the Beatport top charts every single week and making the project files available to anyone who wants them. You'll also get access to a private Discord where you can ask me and the community questions, as well as share tracks for feedback. If you or your music are not quite ready for a shot in the arm like that, I've also made you a completely free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that have helped me figure out how to completely finish one new song each and every single week. And you can grab that free Ultimate Song Finishing Toolkit by visiting the first link that's in the YouTube description here. However, if you just feel like staying on YouTube for now, that's totally fine. Save that link for later, and check out this playlist filled with videos just like the one you just watched, where I completely create songs inspired by tracks found in the Beatport top charts. Or if you really want to take what you've learned in this video to the next level, make sure you check out this video right here.